Alrighty, hi everybody. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. We are here in the offices of Skeptic magazine. Here's our latest issue, still in print, unlike a lot of magazines, as well as digital. Of course, you can read it on your smartphone, your tablets, your iPad, your laptop, or you can just go to the bookstore or just email our office, and we have copies right there at that shelf I'm pointing to. We'll mail them to you. This is our latest issue on energy matters. We've got thematic issues now, as those of you who are regular listeners know. We did, trans matters, abortion matters, race matters, nationalism matters, economic matters, and the latest one on energy matters. So, and the one after that that comes out in 2 months is on education matters, how to reform education. As if we know, no one really knows. Anyway, okay, my guest today is Dr. Thomas Curran, professor of psychology at the London School of Economics and author of a landmark study that the BBC hailed as the first to compare perfectionism across generations. His TED Talk on perfectionism has received more than 3 million views. I watched it. It was great. It wasn't perfect, but sorry, I did put that in there. But it was near perfect, whatever that means. His research has been featured in media ranging from the Harvard Business Review to New Scientist to CNN. And he's appeared on numerous television and radio shows. He's the author of, here it is, the new book, The Perfection Trap, Embracing the Power of Good Enough. Thomas, nice to see you.
It's great to be here, Michael.
So what's your story? Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get into studying perfectionism? Besides, as you concede in the first chapter, you're a perfectionist.
Exactly.
Maybe that wasn't such a good thing.
Exactly right. Yeah. So my background, very quick whistle stop tour. I was born in the UK in a very small town. Grew up a working class background. Didn't really expect to end up here. Not quite sure how I've ended up here, but nevertheless, I did manage to get into university, and I studied sport, and I became really interested in why it is that athletes can sometimes succumb to pressure and other athletes are able to thrive. And that kind of got me thinking a lot about personality, about motivational factors, about psychology more generally. And I went to university, doing a postgraduate degree, PhD, which I think I did reasonably well in because I ended up doing a postdoc and getting a professorship. And really, it was at that time when I started to interact with young people and also reflecting on my own perfectionism that I thought, this is really something we should probably be looking at, maybe at a bit of a broader scale, trying to understand what's going on more broadly among people in terms of perfectionism. So I was the first one, as you mentioned in the intro, to look at perfectionism over time. Found some really interesting findings about perfectionism growing over time among young people. And that's really where my research started to rise to prominence. Did the TED Talk, wrote the book, and here I am now.
Nice. So one of my personal interests, I may one day write a book about this, we'll see, is how lives turn out. Genes, environment, and luck. So how does a working class guy end up at the London School of Economics with all these fancy degrees on the cutting edge of scientific research? What do you attribute this to?
A luck and hard work. Happenstance, being in the right place at the right time, coming through in a generation at a very unique time in the UK where we were supported to go to university. Coming through at the right time at a university where I happened to intersect with the right people. Who could take me on to do a PhD, having a reasonably healthy life and being able to not focus and put everything of myself into my PhD without anything or anybody really holding me back, and alongside a lot of hard work and a lot of self-discipline and a lot of, I guess, intellect, maybe I could say, I ended up where I am. But I think it's so important as I reflect on that journey to recognize that, yes, I'm very proud of where I've come and what I've achieved, but I also realize that I wouldn't have done it without people helping me along the way, and a huge slice of luck too.
Yeah, I really think luck is highly underplayed, and because it's hard to compute and calculate and put it in an equation of, a, say, regression analysis of why things happen the way they do, what the cause of things is. You just go left instead of right. You end up at this school instead of that school. You meet this professor instead of that professor. And this professor's studying perfectionism and the other one's studying something else. Had you been born 50 years ago, you'd be, I don't know, running rats in a Skinner box or something, right?
Yeah.
So much of how things turn out is just highly contingent.
Yeah, and it's really reflecting on that actually as part of the book has been quite meditative because you realize that sometimes that's just fate, and fate is nothing personal. I think we put a lot of our lives into trying to channel ourselves and be the author of our own destiny and control and perfect everything and all around us. When actually sometimes we just have to let the flow of life unfold and let it take us in directions that it's taking us. And that's been really, just as a broad philosophy, really helped me break through my own perfectionism and also reflect on my own life in ways that I think are a lot healthier by being able to understand that gratitude, for being here and having those opportunities and meeting the right people. Those were very fortunate moments, and to be gratified in those moments and have some sense of gratitude for it is really healthy, I think, and and really allows us to savor, I suppose, where we are and reflect and um, be satisfied from our achievements. And I think that's
Hmm. Yeah. So perfectionism. First, what does perfect even mean? To which you would then strive toward. What?
well, I mean, what exactly? How long's a piece of string? It's one of these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. Exactly.
Is one of these things that can't be defined. And there are very few domains of life where perfection is actually something we can pinpoint and say that's a perfect outcome. Often it's nebulous. It's difficult to know where it ends or where it begins, and it can change from time to time and situation to situation, and that's the most difficult thing about perfectionism more broadly is because we don't really understand what exactly it is. We're constantly chasing a nirvana. We're constantly chasing an unattainable goal because once we reach a set of a standard, we're unable to rest or find satisfaction in that standard because perfectionism makes us keep going, makes us keep moving forward. The better we do, the better we are expected to do. And I've described it in the book a bit like chasing the horizon. Right? The closer you get, the further it moves away, and that really, I think, if I could define perfectionism in a metaphor, I'd say it looks a bit like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's more of a not a goal to reach, but just I don't know, a set of intermittent goals. Like I just want to get a little bit better tomorrow than I am today, and that will never end.
It's like it being on a treadmill essentially, where there is no off switch, and you're constantly breathless, striving to move towards a moving target, essentially. And that I think again, this book has been quite clarifying because it's obviously I'm in the research. I work with perfectionistic people. And I do data analysis lab experiments, but also having reflected on my own difficulties with perfectionism. One of the things that struck me time and time again is I always had these goals. Like I want to get here, and then I want to get here, and then I want to get here. And I think if I just get there, like if I just get my PhD, then I'm going to be happy. And if I just get a house, I'm going to be happy. And if I just start a family, I'm going to be happy. And all of these kind of life stages. And and perfectionism has this weird and pernicious way of turning those dreams into nothing more than dead ends. Because once you hit them, then there's always the next thing, and there's always the next thing, and that's the relentless nature about perfectionism. There really is no way that we can just savor and be content. There has to be
You
more.
got this great quote from David Burns: "Perfection is a man's ultimate illusion. It simply doesn't exist in the universe. If you're a perfectionist, you're guaranteed to be a loser in whatever you do."
That's a great quote. I love that quote.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Because that's the what is that? That's the hedonic treadmill. This constant relative comparison to others or moving standards, and so you'll never get there. It doesn't matter how big your house is. If somebody has a bigger house, then you feel like you have a smaller house or whatever your metric is, and
Yeah,
that's the trap.
that's the trap. Exactly right. That's the perfection trap. It's a never-ending set of expectations that always continually moves away from us, and it's an exhausting experience for those who try to scale those dizzying heights.
Hmm. Yeah. I mentioned Skinner's boxes. I was trained in a kind of a behaviorist lab. That's how old I am. This is just before the cognitive revolution.
Yeah.
So one of the things our professors emphasized was, operationally define exactly what it is you want to study so you can measure it in some way. So the rat pressing the bar, close the electric switch, that counts as a 1 on the counter. That's an operational definition of, just of a behavior, the behavior of the organism. So how do you operationally define something that doesn't exist? Right? Or I guess perfectionism. What are we even talking about there?
Okay, so perfectionism then is really this kind of desire and need to be perfect encapsulated in a personality characteristic that we use several different indices to measure. It's a self-reported questionnaire like most personality characteristics. And really what we're interested to get at is this sense of needing and striving to be perfect and nothing but perfect. That's to say, putting unrelenting self-expectations on ourselves, but also in combination with difficulties when we haven't met those standards. So when we haven't been perfect, there is self-criticism, a lot of rumination and worry about not meeting those standards. So we operationally define it with two core components. That's a self-set striving and a harsh self-criticism. But it's a little bit more complex than that. And a lot of this is always what psychologists will say. It's not quite as simple as just that broad definition. There's different elements or dimensions of perfectionism too. So underneath that kind of broad definition of high standards and self-criticism, you have various different ways in which it can manifest and look like. And this, by the way, comes from decades of talking to perfectionistic people, doing data analyses by lots of people who aren't me, who have done a lot of the heavy lifting. And they come to the conclusion that perfection is multifaceted. So it has this high self-set goals. It's called self-oriented perfectionism, this sort of need and desire to be perfect and nothing but perfect. But it also has social elements too. So it isn't just about me wanting to be perfect. It's also about my feeling that you want me to be perfect too, and that the world around me expects me to be perfect all the time. That's called socially prescribed perfectionism. And you see perfectionistic people describe these social pressures all the time. And the third one is called other-oriented perfectionism, and that's perfectionism that's projected outwards onto other people. So my high self-set goals I have for myself, my harsh self-criticism that I have for myself when I haven't been perfect, is going to also apply to you too. So if I'm hauling myself over hot coals to get this unattainable outcome, then you are certainly going to have to do that too. And it's called other-oriented perfectionism. And these people have excessively high goals for other people, and they're very punitive when they haven't met them. So these three core elements are what we consider to be perfectionism, what's called a multidimensional model of perfectionism. And we measure it using a paper and pencil questionnaire. And naturally, we can all be somewhere along the spectrum of each. Some could be high on one, some could be low on another. We've all got our own unique constellation.
All right, let's go over this. It's on page 41 here. Let's just go through the scale. This is the shorter version of the longer scale, I presume. So it's a 7 points from strongly disagree, disagree, only slightly disagree, unsure, and then only slightly agree, agree, and strongly agree. So the higher the number, the more I agree with the following statements. Okay, so this is self-oriented perfectionism. I must be perfect at the things that matter to me. Okay, I actually took the test. There's my numbers. So I put a 5 there. I guess, I want to be good, but, perfect. I don't even know what that would be. Like I write an article, I go over it and over and over. And at some point I just go, the hell with it. It's good enough. And it's the deadline is in an hour. So I just send. Right. So I'd give that a 5, something like that. Maybe somebody else goes to the last minute or something. If I screw up or fall short, I'm hard on myself. Well, kind of. So yeah, it's a spectrum. So I'm medium spicy hard on myself. I don't beat myself up, but I'm like, come on, Shermer. Right. I hold myself to an exceptionally high standard. Again, a 5. I have fairly high standards, but they're also realistic, given my age and cognitive abilities or whatever. I kind of know where I can reach. If I do not appear or perform perfectly, I feel a lot of guilt and shame. Well, another 5, a little bit, not a massive amount, right? So, I strive to be perfect. So I put a 4 because, again, I don't know what that means. I had a 24 in your first self-oriented perfectionism. Okay, here's a socially prescribed perfectionism. When I slip or fall short, people are right there waiting to criticize me. Well, it depends who it is. I guess, my family, they're pretty nice to me when I screw up. So I put a 4 there and kind of in the middle. Everyone else is perfect and they're judging me if I'm not perfect too. Again, which people? I mean, my colleagues, my friends, my family, acquaintances. I think the context is very dependent, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those close to me will accept nothing less than perfection. No, I put a 3 or 4. People tend to get upset with me if I don't do things perfectly. 3. I mean, they don't get mad at me. It's like, come on, something like that. Everybody expects me to be perfect. I don't know. Again, who? Anyway, that's probably enough of that. I just want to give people a sense that you do have a metric here, much like psychologists that study happiness or purposefulness. They have these scales, or you take the big 5 personality dimensions, and you just have these scores that are reliable across time and so on. Are they valid? Are they really measuring what you think they're measuring? So here was my question for you. How do you know you're measuring perfectionism and not, say, internal versus external locus of control or status seeking or high conscientiousness on the big 5, something like that?
Yeah, and of course, this is the difficulty with self-reported measures. The psychometrics or validity, reliability is always something that we have to bear in mind. And no measure is perfect. Far from it, actually. All of these instruments are blunt instruments, and we have to bear that in mind whenever we are disseminating our findings. And thank you for bringing this up, by the way, because this is something that isn't often asked about, but something that's vitally important. But what we can do is we can go about a process where we can talk to as many perfectionistic people as we possibly can. We can try to understand their thought processes, their cognitions, their behaviors, and their emotional emotions, what the things they think and feel. And we can do that over many hundreds and hundreds of people and try to distill from that a set of common beliefs that map onto these 3 broad areas that we've talked about. And for a process of distillation, we can come up with a set of items, some of which you've read. And each one of those items will measure something about perfectionism, but they'll also measure something about other things, like you've just mentioned, their locus of control or conscientiousness or whatever it might be. But together, those items say something about perfectionism. It's how they sing in concert that matters, not what each individual item is asking. And so, in order to try to capture that commonality among the items, what we do is we'll often put them in. We'll take the commonalities through what's called a latent variable. So we'll take the common correlation between all of those items, which is perfectionism, keep that variance, and get rid of anything else that's measuring other things, so that what we have left over is something that we can be as sure as we possibly can, and we can never be 100% sure, far from it, as sure as we possibly can that what we're capturing in that is perfectionism, self-oriented, socially prescribed, other-oriented. But I think, and that's how we work as scientists in psychology. But I think what you're raising this point is so important, because people need to understand that in psychology, our measures are imperfect. They contain a lot of error. They contain a lot of variance that perhaps has to do with other things and not captured by the things we think we're measuring. And this is so important when people read psychological studies, when they read books by psychologists, particularly if they're based on self-reported work. It's so important to bear that in mind, that these are imperfect measures, they're blunt instruments. We get a picture, but there are also caveats are involved.
Yeah, interesting. Good. I'm glad you said all that. It's that, and then the trap part would also seems to me very variable between people in terms of to what extent it causes a problem in your life. So I want to have high standards, but if I never turn in my book my book manuscript, and the publisher's going to ask for the money back, and if I say, well, but it's not perfect, it's like, well, too bad. So then I would say then that's a problem.
Yeah.
But if I turn it in too early and I only read it through once and it's just really crappy, then that's not good either. So there's some middle ground there.
Of course, it's all about moderation, and one of the things that's important to recognize that you don't want to be in the tails, and because the tails are bad places to be in any form of psychology. Whether it be growth mindset, whether it be conscientiousness, striving toward meticulousness. All of these things that are absolutely good, but taken to an extreme, are perfectionism. Essentially, there's a sweet spot. of striving, of application, where we're putting in enough effort for us to make sure it's diligent, that we're crossing the T's and dotting the I's. We're making sure that what we're putting out there is a reflection, a good reflection on us. That's to say that the work is of a standard, but at the same time, not going to the extreme of that diligence to the point at which we're compromising the quality. We're iterating, we're tinkering too much that now we're actually overworking the butter. If you know what I mean, like it's becoming something that's actually of a lesser quality than if we were to be able to let it go when it was a stage where it was good enough. So it's like anything with these psychological features: striving, conscientiousness, growth mindset. Anything, if it's ever taken to the extreme, then you're into the realm of perfectionism. And if you're into the realm of perfectionism, that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, as a type specimen, I like your discussion of Steve Jobs, because he does seem like the archetypal perfectionist. The Walter Isaacson biography certainly brings this out about how he, just fussed over every tiny little detail to the point where the product, well, to me, it seems like this is the trap part, where, the product is late. He misses his launch dates and he's firing people and screaming at people, and over some tiny little thing, like there's a, the corner of the edge of the computer is too straight. It should be a curved edge. Like I'm looking at my MacBook Pro here. It's, beautifully curved and all that, but just, so I'm glad he did that, I guess, because it is a beautiful machine. But, at some point, apparently he was just a real asshole to work for.
Yeah. And he's in my book. I tried to use him as a descriptor of other-oriented perfectionism, because certainly reading his own testimony, the testimony of people that work with him, and Walter Isaacson's wonderful biography, by the way, for the listeners, it's a really illuminating read. Was quite evident that there was some other-oriented perfectionistic tendencies there, or perhaps that kind of resembles other-oriented perfectionistic tendencies, and the projection of his own high standards onto other people. And while certainly, undoubtedly, Jobs turned Apple's fortunes around. It's the biggest company in the world right now, I think, maybe, or if not one of them. It's an incredible story, success story. And in no short way down to him. But on the flip side, what came with that success was, of course, a lot of strife, a lot of relational conflict, a lot of difficulty in the workplace, and a lot of products that came out of that period that took a long time, that could have quite happily been signed off a lot earlier and wouldn't have compromised their success. So I suppose what I'm saying is it did the job, but it was a very inefficient way of doing the job, if that makes
sense. Yeah, I just looked it up on my iPhone. The Apple stock at the moment, $177.79 per share, $2.796 trillion company. It was $3 trillion, I think, a couple of weeks ago. In any case, I think that is the highest any company has ever been in the history of the world, and it's even bigger than like half the countries in the world. So yeah,
no small part down to Jobs.
Yeah. So, but you talk about the survivor bias, which is that we're picking the winners and then going, okay, what's the secret sauce there? Like again, people going through Isaacson's biography and go, okay, so here's the formula. You go to a elite liberal arts college, you drop out, you move back to your parents' house, you start a company in their garage with your buddy, and then you treat everybody like a total asshole, and then you get to be Apple.
Yeah, and this goes back, I think, to what we started this conversation talking about. No one person's path is completely linear, and no one person's path can be perfectly mirrored onto someone else to produce the same results. There's so much unknown. There's so much externality. There's so much noise, and what this is the reason why I raise this in the book is because one of the things that I find problematic when we're talking about perfectionism, you'll often say, well, look at Jobs, look at Serena Williams, look at John McEnroe, look at Demi Lovato, look at all of these amazingly high-profile performers who say they're perfectionistic people. So surely, isn't it the perfectionism that got them there? But the data doesn't support that. We can come on to that later. But more importantly, what we're seeing here is only the tip of the iceberg. What we're seeing are people that have come through some really difficult selection process that has required a lot of daring, a lot of grit, a lot of determination, a lot of hard work, yes, a lot of talent, but also an incredible amount of luck, being in the right place at the right time, having the opportunities, meeting the right people, coming from the right social circumstance, having the right genes if you're an athlete. There are so many factors outside of the perfectionism that meant they got to where they were. And if we only look at the winners, then what we don't see is underneath so many hundreds of millions of other perfectionistic people with the exact same traits who haven't quite made it to the top. And so survivor bias is really a selection bias that it leads us to incorrect conclusions about what it means to be successful. And if you really want to understand success, talk to people who didn't quite make it, because their reasons for not quite making it are just as illuminating, if not more illuminating, about what it means to be successful.
I don't know if you ever heard the Jerry Seinfeld riff on the gold, silver, and bronze medals in the Olympics. Of course, the gold medalist is happy he won, and the bronze medalist is happy because at least he's on the podium. But the silver medalist, first loser. It's like the gold medal winner, world champion, hero of the world, everybody world famous, and so on. Silver medalist, never heard of him. And it was like 1/100th of a second. Oh, it's like, what could you possibly explain that with? And there's 100 variables in that difference.
So true. So true.
Or, like these NBA finals that go down, seventh game of the finals, the seventh game goes into overtime and one team wins by 1 point. They're the world champions and the other guys are the, first loser. Really? I mean, is there really a difference there?
Yeah, it's so true. And these are the margins, but this is the world, Michael, this is the world we live in too, like we only celebrate the winners. Like, all you see on these high performance podcasts, radio shows, TV shows, documentaries, films, is people that have made it to the very top. That we can learn from those people because they're the ones who've made it, and that's all you ever see. And social media has kind of blown this out of all proportion, by the way. So if you're a young person coming into this world and you're seeing that, the unicorn achiever, the 0.01%, that's the expectation. Like, seriously? Like, no wonder they're struggling under this weight of expectation, because this is so unrealistic, so improbable that, but they think it's obtainable, they think it's desirable because that's all they see and that's all we celebrate and that's the only it's the only platform we give. And so, there's perfectionism is part of this, because perfectionism is really hidden by survivor bias, and it's one of the reasons we lionize it. But survivor bias, I think, right now is a real big problem in our society.
Yeah. For sure. There was a quarterback at the Minnesota Vikings in the 70s named Fran Tarkenton, who I really loved because he was kind of short and very fast, scrambling Fran Tarkenton. No one could catch him. And he went to 4 Super Bowls and lost all of them. So after he retired, he went on the lecture circuit, like, how do you deal with losing 4 straight, the perfect loser? Didn't win once.
But that's a guy I'd go and see.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because that's the fate of most people. Most of the time you're not going to succeed.
And the fact that he went 4 times and didn't make it doesn't say anything about him. It says everything about just being in the wrong place,
Right.
like just being unlucky.
Right.
Like, seriously, the law of averages would suggest that he would have won at least one of those.
Yeah.
But it just didn't happen, and that's fate sometimes.
I don't know if you saw the Netflix series, The Last Dance, with Michael Jordan's final season. And then they kind of did a whole retrospective of his whole career and the whole Chicago Bulls era and all that stuff. It was just phenomenal. About, talk about a perfection. He would be the Steve Jobs, I think, in sports of this, and what he would do to motivate himself to just get a little bit better each time and then push his other teammates to be even better. It was just astonishing. I mean, he said in his own mind, he would make up some reason to get pissed off at one of the other players on the other team. So he could just like that guy, I'm going to destroy that mother. Even though the guy didn't actually do anything. And Jordan even said, he didn't actually do anything. I just had this in my head so I could get motivated.
Yeah, that's it. Like, that's the drive sometimes. But that again, like, it goes back to these, I think, and Jordan's a good example. Like, we showcase these people, that these are the people we watch, we want to learn from, which is fine, and we can make some learnings from them. But at the same time as Jordan had all of that, the wonderful motivation and intense drive, he also had incredible genes to be able to be of a certain physique and body type for him to be able to play basketball at an elite level. And that's also something we have to consider, because I was a very good football player, for instance, when I was younger. But I was a late maturer, so all these kids were developing way later than I was. So I just got brutally cut from the system. And at the time, I took that very personally. But reflecting on it now, there's nothing I could do about it. I was just born like that, and that's just fate. It is the way it is. So I think these documentaries showcasing these top performers are illuminating, very entertaining. But we have to be careful about like the extent to which we can take learnings from them, extrapolate them to most people.
Yeah. Because of your book and recommendation, last night I watched the University Varsity Blues, Operation Varsity Blues, right?
Yeah.
That was, of course, I know the story because here in the States, particularly in California, it was on the news constantly. But the acting and reenactment of how that all unfolded. But your point in that is what? That we have this unrealistic standards of what a good education will be. There's only so many spots in those top 10 or 20 or 30 universities and colleges. So this resulted in parents paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, way more than they would have paid in tuition,
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
top of the tuition to get their kids into these schools.
But Michael, there was an important point about the Varsity Blues. It said something broader about society, and that was that these parents are rich enough to have got their kids in through the front. They could have just endowed a lab or paid for the sports block or something. There was routes in where the alumni would have made entry to their offspring, but that wasn't enough because they wanted the perception that kids did it on merit. And this is the important point about the Varsity Blues. It wasn't enough for parents to say their kids got to Yale, Princeton, or wherever. But what was most important is the perception that they got there under their own steam. And given the competitive nature of college, given how hard it is for even the very top of society to gain entry into these elite institutions, they felt the need to guarantee their places through backdoor access, which William Rick Singer was his service was essentially to get them in through the back door via various ways of fraud. Um, one of which was at the sports teams, and the other one was to have exam takers take exams for children. So for me was like the most important part of this story, that there is just so intense pressure on parents and young people today to excel, as to say, to make it into the very, very elite. Going back to what we were saying a minute ago, that 1%, that exceptional level. And it's so intense, it's so important that you start to see these kind of very warped behaviors and these and criminality essentially taking place in order to secure it. And then what happens downstream? Well, obviously not everyone can afford those services. So what we have is really a very pressurized environment right now in the US, but it's happening in the UK too, where parents are worrying anxiously about their kids' futures. They are so concerned about them not making it to a certain university because they feel like that's going to harm their life chances. And actually, by the way, that's a very real concern, because at the moment what we're seeing is not meritocracy. So the middle class is certain that you're not seeing nurses, policemen, teachers, living standards improving, and if anything, they've been deteriorating and will continue to deteriorate. It's a very elite, narrow set of professions right now that guarantee access to what we might consider a good life. That's finance, law, medicine, and perhaps you can include tech these days too. That's a lot of pressure. That's an exclusive band of jobs which only a certain number of kids are going to gain entry to each year. And we're talking here top 5, top 10% of kids. Can you imagine like how much pressure that is for young people, and how much pressure it is for parents to keep pushing their children to do more, to be more, to excel, to get A's all the time, never stop. You've got to keep doing better. And even when they have done well, there's still more that they can do. And this is the conveyor belt of expectation, of pressure, that right now is having a massive impact on parents more generally through the phenomenon of helicopter parents. And the Varsity Blues scandal, I think, was really the tip of the iceberg, the crescendo of this incessant pressure encapsulated in one big scandal.
In that story, at least on the Netflix presentation, they said Rick Singer started off as just kind of a regular coach or counselor to help students navigate the environment of applying and taking the SAT and prepping for the SAT. That's all legitimate. is it possible that he got sucked into it? He started off with good intentions and then got sucked into it, and his clients are pushing him to get to perform more, to produce more for them.
Absolutely, I've no doubt that that was how it worked. I think I watched the documentary too, and I would agree with your analysis there. It started as a fairly benign, innocent activity where he was providing after school services, mentoring for young people and their families, and how to access these top universities. But you've got to remember, at the same time as the parents were applying pressure, the universities themselves were becoming more exclusive, right? More difficult to gain access to. And then Singer would have been front line in this. He would have seen this, and he would have been experiencing this in his own work, right? Like, he's finding it harder and harder to get his clients' kids into these schools through legitimate means, because the numbers going was dwindling, and the percentage of kids whose applications are accepted into these colleges are falling. I mean, it's never been more competitive today, even after this scandal. It's never been more competitive today. And certainly it's been gradually getting more and more exclusive, more and more selective, more and more difficult. So naturally, of course, how do you respond in that context? You may have certain bad actors who identify a loophole, a niche in the market. You think, well, actually, hold on a minute. There is another way we can do this, and look to exploit that. And I think, if it wasn't Rick Singer, it may have been someone else. I'm sure it would have been someone else. Such is the pressure. Such is the pressure.
As you know, the Supreme Court just voted on the affirmative action in university admissions, but there's also pressure to end legacy admissions. So legacy admissions, well, that's a pretty elitist thing. I went to Harvard. My grandfather went to Harvard. My dad went to Harvard. I want to go to Harvard. Or these weird sports, like if you're into rowing or crew, or I don't know what some of these weird sports are. Why would that get a special nod? It beats me, but I guess maybe it's a proxy for that elitist family history or something like that class.
Yeah, I think it's, well, I my understanding is, and I haven't gone through the US system, so I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that the varsity, the sports is an important part of the university reputation. NCAA is really, it looks good for universities to be at the top of the tables for each of the sports that are represented in those categories. So I think just as their reputation in an academic sense is very highly guarded, also their prowess in sports is an important part of the US college system. I don't know, but that's my understanding, and as a consequence, that's why you get these college places for elite sports people.
Yeah, interesting. And so the universities themselves are just doing what like an athlete would do. I'm just trying to gain every little advantage I can. And each university wants to do that because they're standings in the U.S. News and World Report rankings or whatever. So they're manipulating the system in the same way that Wall Street traders do, or everybody's just trying to do their thing and be as good as they can. So the system itself has a certain corruption. You discuss Lance Armstrong in your book, so I thought I'd bring that up since you probably know I used to be a professional cyclist in the 80s, and I know Lance. And, I think the only mistake he made with the Oprah interview, since you reenacted that in the book, was not being clear enough about how pervasive the doping was. And that, we did this, because there was this kind of culture. Well, I think he could have been clear, like everybody was doping, Oprah, everybody. And we now know, now all these years later, that every single person on the podium with him has been busted for doping and said, oh yeah, of course we were doping. The entire team was doping. And there was this Operation Puerto, the Spanish doping doctor. Lance had hired Michele Ferrari, was the top doping doctor. The second guy down had this lab in Spain that wasn't as good. And so the authorities, this is how, instead of drug testing, they actually just went into the lab and confiscated all his records. And he wasn't very smart about it. I think he used the initials of the athletes on the samples and stuff, just like really dumb, right? So they had everybody. And it wasn't just cyclists. There were soccer players and tennis players and swimmers and so on. I mean, it was pretty pervasive, such that it's clear everybody was doing it. So, it's hard to finger any one athlete and say, well, you're a cheater. when everybody is doing it and the authorities are not enforcing the laws, much like Wall Street. If you let these guys get away with it, they'll do it. You got to have strong regulations, or else, and you really can't blame them. Just like in basketball, you got to have referees. They'll do whatever they can to get away with what they can. Jordan used to talk about this. The little tricks he'd use to, like, if the referee was in or there was one of the athletes was in between him and the referee, then he could do something that he couldn't do if the referee could see him, and he would do this all the time. It's not exactly cheating. It's really the job of the referees to just kind of lay hard on these guys to stop this.
Yeah, and I really wanted. It's really interesting you bring that up, because that's exactly my read of Lance Armstrong's interview. And I watch a lot of cycling. I'm an avid cyclist myself, so I had a sort of good understanding of his era more generally. And there was really things that was really I picked out really interesting from Lance's interview, because he's absolutely right. And it's interesting you say that too, because I think he could have been a lot more forthright on that point. And it was actually the thing I wanted to pick out as a broader lesson for the society that we live in more broadly, that this is, if you operate inside a culture that gives you no choice, right? If everybody else and all around you is engaging in this practice, then what do? What choice do you have? You don't have any other choice but to go along with what everyone else is doing. And that's the same right now. The lesson I tried to bring from the Lance Armstrong experience, and I hope I was compassionate in describing Lance, because I really do think there was no alternative, and it's all very well, the lay media who don't understand the cycling scene and what was going on at that time and quite how widespread it was to sort of lay into Lance. But actually, like, if you take it in the round and you understand what actually happened in the culture at the time, and that everyone in the peloton, it wasn't like one or two, like everyone in the peloton was doping at that time. How do you escape that? How do you escape that? And it's the same in broader culture right now. The very same arms race is operating right now. That if all around us and everyone that we see is perfect, then we are naturally going to believe that perfectionism is itself desirable, obtainable, something that we should be searching for, something that we should be aiming towards, because we live in a culture and a society where everyone else is doing that. And so that's really like why I brought that story, because I think it teaches us a lot about how we are as humans, how our natural instinct is to really go with the herd, even if herd behavior is decidedly unhealthy, just like it's unhealthy to shoot for perfection, just like it was unhealthy for the peloton to dope, because obviously that had health implications. And if everyone else is doing it, of course, it makes no one cyclist more likely to win. That's the other point here. By the way, you either all doping or you're all not doping. But you can't have that middle ground, because then there's not a level playing field, right? And that's what he said in Oprah's interview. It wouldn't have been a level playing field. And it's, again, as I say, that's the same in society, right? If you can't just have one or two or three, or some people shooting for perfection and some people not. Like, it's either got to be everyone or no one. And that's what we're seeing today. Everyone's sort of scrambling for this unrealistic ideal of perfection, and I think it's having a major impact on our health and happiness. And yeah, as I think Lance's story about the peloton in those days is quite illuminating in that respect.
Yeah, I did an article for Scientific American on doping in sports, and I interviewed Frankie Andreo, one of Lance's postal teammates, who said, yeah, he doped. He didn't really want to do it, but everybody was doing it, and it wasn't that he could do it and he just wouldn't win the tour, because he wasn't going to win the tour anyway. He'd be lucky to win a single stage ever. He was a domestique, but he said after EPO was introduced and everybody kind of figured out how to use it properly along with the other drugs and training and so on, that he would just get dropped, and that, Lance would send him back to get some water bottles to the team car. Then he'd have to work his way back up through the peloton to the front where the postal team is, and he couldn't even do that. And he goes, there's guys I could drop at any time now. They're just dropping me. He said, so what are my choices? You just quit the sport and you go, and most of these guys have no education. Like most athletes, they start very young. They never go to college.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's what you've worked for all your life. Are you seriously saying, like, you're going to look at this situation and go, oh, well, okay, I'll throw it in. I'll do something else. I mean, it's just not an option, right? Like, so I have a lot of empathy. For the cyclists at that time, for sure.
But the larger take home here is back to education. It's hard to blame any one university, I guess. I mean, Harvard wants to be the top, I guess. or it's Caltech or it's Princeton or Yale. There's like they kind of cycle through all top 20 of them or so. What's wrong with going to UC San Diego rather than UCLA? The answer is nothing. But somehow UCLA is higher on the ranking for whatever reason. And so then the recruiters are under pressure by their parents. Oh, I want my kid in that one. Well, what's wrong with you? No, not UC San Diego, UCLA. And then that starts you down that path, I guess.
Yeah, it's incentive structure. I mean, as soon as we started ranking universities, these sort of perverse incentives started to creep in. And particularly these days where it's more about the label, it's more about the, rather not less about the education, more about the badge, like where were you? And that's understandable, by the way, because recruiters also look at that too. They say they don't, but there is absolutely no doubt that a recruiter will certainly prioritize applications from the what we call Russell Group. I suppose you call them the Ivy League, right? So there is also
you mean corporate recruiters,
corporate recruiters, yeah, like because they have so many applications, so of course they're going to select by certain criteria, and they won't say that, but it does happen, and it happens here in the UK too. Corporate recruiters, those jobs that I talked about, this very narrow set of professions, they have so many applications that they will certainly select for Russell Group. And that's one of the reasons why my university is so selective. And one of the reasons why we have such good job numbers is because everybody particularly in finance at the LSE, they see the LSE badge and there's kind of it's an endorsement of this person that they have a good education, they have a good background. So I don't blame parents, I don't blame kids, I don't even blame the universities. It's a systemic issue that's born of perverse incentives and prioritizing esteem over education.
What is your sense of to what extent a college education is worth it? And I guess the question would be, what's the metric? Worth it, you mean lifetime income or happiness or a fulfilling life or better marriages, or I don't know what the measure would be.
Really good question. I think education has traditionally been worth it. The college premium is something that for many, many decades has been a real thing and has lifted people like me out of working class backgrounds into, I would say, a better standard of living than my parents had. So it's been a success on a personal level, no doubt about that. But today we have a different world. And the answer to that question is less clear. I think if you're getting yourself into those very narrow set of professions, then absolutely, 100%, a university degree is going to be essential and will pay off in the long run. But there's an open question as to anything underneath that, whether the degree is still worth it. I think young people are graduating, they're finding jobs are insecure, poorly paid. They move from one place to another. They're finding it much more difficult to settle down. Houses are really expensive in the metropolitan areas where the jobs are. And a college degree, far from helping, in some cases, is giving a lot of debt, is giving them a lot of obligations in terms of paying back, servicing that debt, and isn't necessarily providing the standard of living or the opportunities that perhaps young people have been promised when they were encouraged to go by their parents or their school teachers or whatever it might be. I'm a teacher, I'm a lecturer. I don't want to say yes or no that university is or isn't worth it these days. I think it's a very personal decision. I mean, people make their own, justify their own decisions based on their own circumstances, but it's certainly the case that it's less clear today that going to university is worth it in the long run than it was maybe 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and then the other criteria almost no one brings up that used to be popular was because it makes me a better person. I'm more enriched. My mind is wider. I can read and think about cultural issues, literature, art, music, science, technology, all of that. Going forward, I have just a richer inner life. And absolutely. I don't know how you put a price on that, or what the outcome of that would be in long-term happiness or meaningfulness or something like that.
Absolutely, and I'm a huge advocate for education. I think education is truly the great social leveler. Truly is. I think education is so so important. And my personal opinion is that education should be free for all, and everyone should be able to have access to education and even higher education. This was the European model, still is in some countries. Isn't in the US, isn't in the UK, isn't in Canada, and some other countries, but it is in Europe. And I think that's a fundamental human right. That's my strong, deeply held belief, particularly for kids like me, who really have very few pathways out. And education is really the only one, unless we get really lucky and we develop, we hit upon a really good idea and we make loads of money. Apart from that moonshoot, education is our most, safe, sure way out. However, because it isn't free, because it's a huge investment, and that debt can be like an albatross around young people's neck, particularly if they're not entering into the workforce, being able to service that debt comfortably. It's for me, it's a different equation. And yes, you are brought on. Goodness me, I matured immensely in the years that I was at university. They were the best years of my life, and they were, and I learned so much about myself. And about the things I was studying, but nevertheless, it's a difficult one, Michael. It's a really difficult one. The stats are quite frightening in terms of social mobility and in terms of the to what extent there still is a college premium, and I think young people have to think long and hard about what it is they want to do, what their passions are, and whether university is necessary for them if they're not going to be in those elite professions. But I would still say to any young person who's listening, explore university and do it for the right reasons. Do it because you're really passionate about the topic, you want to learn more, and if that's it's for you, it's for you. But again, it's just a different landscape to what it was 10, 20 years ago, and that just needs to be borne in mind.
Yeah, I don't know what the corrective is, to what extent governments can intervene through tax policy or whatever to kind of nudge universities to do different things. I don't know how you change those rating systems. I mean, that just got started on its own. In California, we have community colleges and then state colleges and then the UC system. So you have a kind of a three-tiered model. So when I got out of high school, graduated 72, community colleges were free. And so I just said, well, I'll just go there and get my GE because I'm going to take all the same classes at the university where I have to pay. It's pretty much the same class. And I just got lucky and just had a couple really great teachers. It was just phenomenal. I thought, wow, lucky me. And then I went to Pepperdine, which was private, but even then it was pretty cheap by today's standards. Yeah. And I could still work and pay half my tuition, and my parents paid the other half, and so forth. But then I went to a state university for a master's degree, and by then I realized that this was just Cal State Fullerton. It's just kind of in the middle of the bell curve, nothing special about it. But every professor there was really good. They were professional scientists, and they'd all been to elite colleges and universities. And I thought, okay, I see what's happening. Post World War II, you have all the boomers that go to college and get graduate degrees, and there's only a handful of jobs at the elite universities. There aren't any more openings at Harvard. So, my mentor, Doug Navrick at Cal State Fullerton, the behaviorist, he got his PhD under Doug Fantino at UC San Diego, who got his PhD under Herrnstein at Harvard, who then, of course, comes from Skinner. So it's like, well, at least I have that lineage. But because of the numbers, you just have this dispersal into these kind of middle of the bell curve universities of really great scholars and minds because they don't have anywhere else to go. Yeah. So really, we have a screwed up ranking system because you can get a great education at these middle of the bell curve universities. Why? Take advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. The best book I've read on this issue is The Meritocracy Trap by Daniel Markovitis.
Oh, yeah.
And you may have read it. And some of his solutions or suggested solutions are to expand enrollment, like hugely expand enrollment. And that's going to mean the hand of government in allowing that to happen, allowing universities to expand and getting more people into the education system. But it's important to view that as an investment, not a drain, because what you see in economies with a more educated workforce are more productivity, higher wages, people doing higher skilled jobs that create more jobs, and that are a spur to economic activity. This isn't, if you look at me, I'm a really good example of this. I was funded to go to university. I was given money to stay on at school. right? And right now I pay way more back through taxation than I would ever have done if I hadn't have had that investment in me, right? I would have been doing something great. This is not, sometimes I sound like I'm talking down to where I come from, and I hope I don't sound like that. It's not the case at all. I would have had a very happy life being a builder or a plumber or whatever. And there's no shade at all. But nevertheless, I'm earning a high amount of money, and that means that I'm paying more taxation, which means the investment that was put in me has led to more investment back into the system, which then can be used to hopefully bring up the economy, but also allow more people to go to university through higher taxation and all the rest of it. So, there's a multiplier effects that, and Markovitis talks very persuasively about this. And I think that's something that we should, in the US and in the UK, we should be really looking to try to do. Expand that enrollment, fund those places, get more people into the university system, because that's where the dynamism is.
Yeah, for sure. And governments do this anyway. Like, we're going to invest in the internet, say in the 70s, through DARPA. It's a good military program, intelligence program, but maybe eventually it'll trickle down to, something like the $1 trillion industry we have of internet sales and so on. Yeah, I mean, there's it's hard to calculate out how it's going to pay off, but as a principle, it should, and it certainly would there. I was just at a conference in which Mike Rowe was the keynote speaker. You may not know him. He's the host of this popular TV show called Dirty Jobs, one of the most popular shows in America. So this guy is a meat and potatoes kind of middle working class guy. He rolls up his sleeves and gets out there. And the TV show is where he goes in with a camera crew to do some dirty job. Who's the guy that cleans the sewers over here? All right, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do it for the day. Right. And he's just such a great sport about it. And he's very entertaining. And he told one story about he went to a ranch where they castrate sheep. And how do you castrate? How's it done? Like the joke about the neophyte asked the rancher, how do you castrate the bull? Well, you use 2 bricks. He goes, oh my God, doesn't that hurt? He goes, not if you keep your thumbs out of the way.
That's great.
Yeah. So, and this particular one had to do with like using your teeth to bite the skin of the scrotum to pull but he had a larger point. That is, he never went to college, and he knows a lot of people that work in the, plumbers and the dirty job people, and they make pretty good money, like 100,000 a year or more, 200,000 a year, electricians and so on. What's wrong with doing that? Why does everybody have to go to college to have some status in life?
I agree with you 100%. I'm with you, and I come from those working class backgrounds, and some of my best friends do those jobs. What I would say though is we've got to be very careful with these conversations, because whenever we have these conversations and middle class professionals say, well, it doesn't have to be a college degree, they're not talking about their kids. Right. They're talking about people like me. They're saying, but it's okay for you to not go to college. Right, but my kids are still going to go. That's not in question. But maybe we should think about college not being a route for other kids. So I 100% agree with the principle of what you're saying. I am with you all the way. And as I say, these people are my good friends, and they do some valuable work that this society couldn't do without. But we also have to be careful in those conversations about who and where and what and who isn't going to go, who is going to go, and in these conversations, and that's a much more difficult thing to talk about. But on your broader point of principle, I agree. I think there is a conversation that needs to be had about whether it has to be a university degree, or whether we can also put money into technical vocational skills too.
Yeah, in fact, he said something that quite surprised me, which is that high schools don't offer shop classes anymore. I don't know if this is true everywhere, but when I was in high school, I took electric shop, metal shop, and wood shop. And I still have some stuff here in my library of stuff I made when I was in middle school and high school and shop. It's just like, yeah, okay. But those skills maybe they're just not trained. Well, they want to send people into tech or whatever, and that's not going to help you. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think there was a big push, wasn't there? Like we had it under Blair, Obama, and Clinton, similar for us, a big education push, that we were going to import those. Certainly in the UK, we imported those skills to keep wages low. And then everybody that was every young person that was coming through the system at the time was given an education, because the theory was that they would be
Yeah.
able to use those skills to do more high paid jobs, more technical jobs, jobs that drive economic activity and all the rest of it. So there was this kind of growth push, whilst at the same time trying to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of control through high rates of immigration. This is kind of how Blair handled the British economy. Similar, I think, in the US too. I'm not sure. I don't know, but this is how it was done under Blair. And that was fine in the early days, but again, like anything, taken to the extreme, you start to see now that everybody's funneled into education, and suddenly there's not enough jobs to accommodate, or well-paid jobs to accommodate all of these graduates coming through, right? And this, I think, this is now why we're seeing the college premium get diluted to the point now where it's that there is a conversation to be had. So I think it's a failure of policy making. It's a failure of not looking long term, thinking these things through, and investing in the economy so that the jobs are there when these young people come out of university. Because it's one thing to funnel them into the system, but if the jobs aren't there, if the infrastructure's not there, if the investment isn't there, then it's going to be difficult for them. So I think it was a failure of long term planning in that respect.
Right. Yeah. All right. Let's talk about personal dealing with perfectionism and how you deal with that. You talk about your TED Talk experience. I watched your TED Talk. I didn't see any shaking legs or cracking voice or any of that. So if you were nervous or hyper critical of yourself or whatever, it didn't come through. But what do you recommend people do when they feel like I really have to be perfect? And if I'm not, I'm going to be super disappointed. What are the kind of things you recommend for that?
Yeah, I think that's a really. In my book, I'm very critical of myself. Because I don't think that I did a great job with the TED Talk at the time. But the problem is with the TED Talk is you can't see it back. So there's you just don't know how it goes. You give it and you have a vague sense, but because there's no way to check that conversation you're having in your head about whether it's any good, there's a lot of uncertainty and unknown, and that can really fester.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I found the TED Talk experience really difficult, and the aftermath of the TED Talk experience really difficult. And I have to say, I didn't deal with it in the most healthy way. I ruminated a lot, worried about it a lot.
You did? Even after?
Yeah, even after, because I felt like I had this weird thing in my mind. I was like, I missed a line. So I was just like, oh, I missed that bit. And then it turned out weirdly that I didn't miss that bit. And this is how your mind kind of...
It's too funny.
It seriously screws with you, because once you get it in your head, and of course you can't do a check on it. So you're just I knew I was nervous, and I knew it wasn't the most erudite, confident, bulletproof speech. I knew there were issues. I knew there were little mistakes, little cheats, little stoppages, and all the rest of it. And then, of course, there was the audience, and the TED audience has a very subtle way to let you know, whether it was a okay talk or whether it was an amazing talk. And
you get the golf clap.
Yeah, exactly. You get the very polite, yep. Okay, next. Whereas, if you bring down the room, it's everyone's on their feet, whooping and hollering and all that shit. And it certainly didn't get that reception. So, of course, that also plays on your mind too. So, this is, by the way, for the perfectionist listener, I'm sure this would be very, you can relate to this. This is how you worry all the time about how you looked, how it appeared, how you did. It's a very common thing among the perfectionists. But I would say there's definitely things we can do. And I've learned a lot from that experience. Now I try to make sure that before I go on stage, I have a good talking to myself. It's okay to screw up. This isn't going to ruin your life chances if you screw it up. It's just a talk, just like you're talking to your family, just like you're talking to your friends. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. So I always try and make sure that I'm in a good mental place before I start. And then afterwards, if I do slip up, which happens from time to time, sometimes we slip up, sometimes we don't give the most pristine performance. Don't go in on yourself, but try as much as you can to see the bigger picture. Recognize that you tried, you put yourself out there, and that's the most important thing. And that there's always next time. Don't haul yourself over hot coals. Be kind to yourself. Be self-compassionate. And that's a really, really important thing, particularly when you've made mistakes.
Yeah. All right, I got a couple of TED conference stories for you that you'll enjoy.
Okay.
So let's see. The first TED Talk I gave in 2006 in Monterey, I checked in with my friend Jared Diamond, who had given one of the earliest TED Talks back in the day, before they did the 18-minute thing, or the 18-minute thing wasn't really enforced or whatever. So he said, "Oh, Michael, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. Don't worry about that clock. Just talk as long as you want." I'm like, "Okay." Anyway, so I kind of medium prepared. And then, but I wasn't until like the second or third day. So the first day, a prominent Harvard astronomer cosmologist gets up to speak, and she just starts going on, and it's great and everything. And then her 18 minutes was up, and she's still talking. And then Chris Anderson comes out and says, well, thank you, so and so. I don't want to give her name, and she goes, well, no, I'm not done yet. He goes, yes, you are. And she goes, no, I got a couple more slides. He goes, no, you don't. I went, oh my God. They're really enforcing this clock. And that was it. She was done, and they never put her talk on the TED Talk, on the TED website. And I'm like, so I went back to the hotel room, cutting slides, and like, okay, I got to get this down to 18 minutes. I don't want to get the hook pulled out on me.
But you know what? That's the thing they don't tell you about TED as well. Like, there's a lot of preamble before, and if they're not satisfied, you're going to be able to get up and do it. They will say no, sorry. Like they will pull you. Because obviously, like, they also have a content and a product and all the rest of it. So this is a lot of pressure goes on behind.
Yeah, totally. Well, the early in '06, they just sent me like a 1-page thing. Here's the things you should do. The second time I did it in 2010, I think it was in Long Beach, and I got like this booklet, like this thick thing. Here's how to do a TED Talk. Like, holy crap, this thing is like super overproduced. And again, it was this time, the day before me, was a MIT astronomer who studies black holes. Anyway, so there was some big finding that day about black holes or something. So Chris brings him up on stage and just, tell us about this finding we just saw. And he was great. Explained it all. And I said, thank you very much. And anyway, then later it was his turn to give his talk. So he gets up there, and all the pressure, he's on the red rug. The clock starts down, and he starts in on the talk, and he's just going through the line after line after line. And then he just freezes like 6 minutes into it. And he's like, So he pulls out his phone out of his pocket, and of course he's got to punch in the code, and then he's got to find it, and he's scrolling through the text. He's like, okay, there it is. All right, hang on. And then he kind of backs up 2 sentences and goes through the blocking sentence and gets like 2 more minutes in, another freeze. He pulls the phone out, and he's scrolling through. And finally, oh gosh, this is just awful. Chris comes out on the stage and says, all right, calm down. Look, we can edit all this, no problem. Why don't you just tell us about your research? Just tell me. Just talk to me. And then he was great. And I thought, okay, this is a good example of, overproduced or over-memorized, and you're not really just talking about your subject or the bullet points in your head. The exact words are what matters, and that would be a perfectionist trap, I think.
100%, 100%. Like, the perfectionists will overthink everything, and and their worry, by the way, is that if they fail, that's the most catastrophic thing, because then that reveals to everyone that they're imperfect, they're flawed, they're deficient, all the rest of it. Like, and that is the one thing they're trying to avoid, and they will try to avoid those things happening to such an extent that they will sabotage your chances of success. And success can mean all sorts of different things. But in the realm of a talk, right, success is a talk that brings people along, that has a crescendo, that has a sense of feeling, that you really connect with the presenter. And there's no way, really, that you can create that talk with the overthinking method by worrying about every minute detail, because at some level there has to be a little bit of play there for the speaker to move with the audience, to move with the situation and the context, and to show themselves. And that's really where the secret is, I think, having now watched and done talks myself, to what is a really good talk. It's all about being yourself, being authentic, and it's really difficult to do that with a perfectionistic mindset that tinkers, iterates, and all the rest of it. Now, having said that, I've never absolutely bombed a presentation using this method. So it's not as if I've ever fallen down and collapsed on my ass, but I've never nailed one either, and that's the difference.
I don't know, but yeah, I didn't get a standing ovation either, but Tony Robbins did when he was there, but he's a professional entertainer, really. You and I are egghead lecturers, and if we can give a talk where it's not just a lecture, then that's good. But someone like a Tony Robbins, I mean, he's on stage; it's a performance.
No,
And I think
absolutely.
that's a different skill set.
It is, but I think I think, as I say, I'm older now. I'm a few years older. I've definitely matured a lot. I've learned a lot, and I'm certainly would take that very same mindset to my next TED talk if I'm ever invited. Ted, if you're listening. But when you go to your first, you don't know what to expect, and you suddenly turn up, and suddenly there's this amazing speaker who just brings down the house, and it is just incredible. It's like, oh my God, okay. Like, this is
Right.
crazy, and I am going to look so bad in comparison. And that's where the worries and anxieties come in. But obviously, having done it once, I think I would be a better place.
Yeah, I guess then personally, again, how high should you set your standards, and who are setting those standards? Well, you look at people above you, let's say, that are doing what you'd like to do, like you're young. So when I got into cycling, it's like, all right, who are the best cyclists around? So I found a couple in Southern California. All right, I'm just going to go hang out with those guys. I just want to see what they do. What do they eat? How much do they sleep? What are their workouts like? Because I just don't know. And then when I got into riding, I was reading a lot of Stephen Jay Gould. So I befriended him. And I just said, okay, so how do you do this? How does it work? How do you get, how do you get a publisher? And, where do you write these essays and get them in magazines and books? And, and then he just kind of walked me through. Oh, okay. Right. Now, I don't, I thought, boy, I'd really like to write in his style. He's just an incredible vocabulary and these paragraph long sentences. And I was like, you know what? I can't do that. I actually just don't have that vocabulary. But in any case, I should probably have my own voice. And so I sort of settled with that, right? And then like Richard Dawkins was kind of a hero and then a friend. And Steve Pinker is now a good friend. It's like, and when I read people like Dawkins and Pinker, they write better than me. I can just tell. People tell me, oh, you're great, right? Yeah, no, not really. I'm not as good as that. And I want to strive to be that good. But what if I don't get that good? So how can I be satisfied? It just generalizes to anybody. That yes, you should set high standards and aim for that guy. But if you don't make it, that's also okay. And, there's the rub, right?
By the way, I love their writing too. And, I read a lot, and you will read a lot of books, and some of them will be okay. Some of them will be not very good, and some of them will be amazing. And it's natural for us to compare ourselves with the amazing ones, right? That's what we want to aspire to. Here's the thing, and I think this is really important for everyone to understand, that in any one discipline, and Nassim Taleb did a useful experiment recently, actually, useful calculation, and he used the realm of sports, interestingly, cycling. And he said, okay, in order to make it to the top, you have to be a Six Sigma individual, right? Now that's 1 in 1.4 million people, by the way. That is so improbable. And most of us are going to, 70% of us to a bell curve, are going to be somewhere around the average, somewhere around the middle. So our writing abilities are going to be somewhere around that. And you know what? Like, there shouldn't be any shame, really, in being where everyone else is. But we have this shame because all we're focused on is the tails. Now, what I think is really important in that lesson is that if we can understand that, if we can wrap our heads around that, then that takes so much pressure off trying to compete, trying to compare. If we can know that we're very probably average, that doesn't preclude us, by the way, from being on the tail. If our talents and efforts take us there, then amazing. Like, savor that, like, enjoy it, drink it in, absolutely. But if they don't quite get us there, that's okay too. And, the more I'm thinking about this, the more I'm trying to reconcile in my mind these kind of two conflicting things where everything pushes us in the direction of excellence. We're always comparing ourselves to those kind of unicorn achievers, which is natural because, of course, we want to write like Dawkins and Pinker. We want to give presentations like Tony Robbins. We want to shoot hoops like Michael Jordan. We want to go up mountains like Vingegaard. Like, these are obviously things that we'd love to do, but they're, of course, so improbable that actually I think there's something quite comforting in knowing that actually we're very probably going to be average, and that's okay. And if we're not, that's amazing. But it doesn't, there's something quite comforting in knowing that, our expectations right now are a little bit warped in the society that we live, and it's okay to be average. There's no shame in that.
By that analogy, then, might you assume yourself to be in the middle of the bell curve? And if you can get one standard deviation above the mean through effort, training, practice, then be happy with yourself for that. But shooting for 6 standard deviations and you only make 4 and you're going to be crushed as a loser, well, that's not healthy.
Not healthy at all. And by the way, most of the peloton will be around 4. You got Vingegaard at the moment who's just completely ridiculous, and you always get one of these individuals a generation, and and you look at them on the TV screen, and you think, oh, that's not a very good performance. They're hanging off the back of the peloton. When you realize that they're 4 standard deviations away from where most people are, suddenly you kind of have a reflection. Actually, no, you know what? They're doing okay.
Yes.
they're quite all right. And again, this goes back to the point I'm making about we are fascinated with the tails, we're fascinated with the winners, the people that make it over the line. And I think as a society, we should be more interested in actually the majority, like where most of us are, and having a conversation about excellence within that framework. Because as you say, if we can get 1 standard deviation, that's a success. If we can get 2, that's amazing. So yeah, I think that's more the conversation we should be having.
Yeah, there was another scene in that The Last Dance documentary series with, besides Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, and Scottie Pippen, the other player, I can't even remember who they are, but they're 4 standard deviations out. Even in the NBA, they're just spectacular athletes. Better than most 99.9% of the people on the planet, and they're sitting there in awe. They interviewed these guys. Oh, I just couldn't believe Jordan did this. I mean, he's just like on another plane. He's on another planet. It's just like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Tyler was more provocative than I was there. He said these are genetic outliers. I think I'm not sure this is right, but like is unhuman basically. Like in terms of their genetics and abilities. And, when someone's so far out, yes, it's great. We can enjoy them and we can watch them, but don't try and emulate.
It's not the whole bit about Vingegaard worked in a fish factory or something. It's like, what does that got to do with anything? We should be trolling through the fish factories to see who else we can find.
Because that way you can get your VO2 max to a level we have never seen before.
Right. It's just too funny. Yeah. Okay, so the larger societal issues that you deal with in your last chapter, UBI, kind of income inequality, bringing up the bottom to a standard of living in which they can pursue their goals reasonably. These are large economic, political issues. I don't know the good solution to these things. Just give us some of your thoughts on what you think should be done. If you were the czar,
yeah,
if you could do things.
Well, thanks, Michael, for giving me the opportunity here, because I think it's so important. I didn't write that last chapter as a manifesto or a kind of prescriptive set of recommendations. I really just wrote it as a thought experiment. Like, what would life be like inside this kind of society? And would we need as much perfectionism as we do today? Because I really wanted to get readers thinking about to the extent to which this is a socially conditioned way of thinking, a way of behaving. How we're living inside a society that requires perfectionism. And the way to really get a grasp of that is to think about an alternative reality and ask ourselves, would we need as much in this kind of world? And I think that's a point of confusion in some of the reviews that I've read about my book so far. It's just been like, well, this is what Curran wants to happen. And it's not the case. I'm simply saying that my thinking is crystallized in 2 ways. One, perfectionism is highly genetic. Nothing we can do about that. But second, that perfectionism comes from the social world around us. So what isn't explained by genetics comes from what's around us. And what's around us is mainly learned in culture, through schools, in social media, the insecure workplace and the rest of it. And all of this pressure comes from an economy that needs to grow at all costs. And before any other considerations, most notably human considerations. And so what I'm saying is, well, what if we didn't live in that world? What if, for instance, we were able to acknowledge that there are thresholds, both planetary and human thresholds, and the goal of a functioning economy really is to stay within those thresholds. Sometimes it will grow in certain sectors, but sometimes certain sectors will not grow because they are destructive or extractive. What if we lived in that world where the priority really wasn't just on goods and services, but also on human needs? Things like happiness, well-being, life expectancy, infant mortality, all of these other sort of metrics around human happiness, human satisfaction, and human well-being. Shouldn't they be also considered in metrics of nations' prosperity alongside GDP? What about inequality and the impact that that has on human welfare and our abilities to fail? I love the quote from Eminem in 8 Mile in his song when he said, "Success is the only option I got. Failure's not." And that's very much what it's like to be at the bottom. Failure isn't an option. If you come from a wealthy background, you can fail and fail and fail, and one time it's going to come off, and you look like the most amazing entrepreneur. But you got one chance. You got one shot if you're at the bottom. And if you don't succeed, then that could be the difference between your tenancy, that paying the bills. It can be really catastrophic. And I think why I talk about UBI and reducing inequality is because I think if we can put a floor on the destitution, then that will free people to pursue their interests and meaning and purpose, be more entrepreneurial because they're not dependent on anybody or anything for their survival or basic needs being met. And, whenever it's been trialed, and there's only been a few very small trials, but interestingly, you see UBI correlated with economic activity to the extent at which now some libertarians are actually coming round to this idea because of the spur it can have on economic activity. But it isn't just UBI. I talk about other things, reductions in inequality, high taxation on wealth, because taxation on wealth is, I think, so important right now, particularly when it comes to leveling the playing field, particularly for younger generations, and things like housing and the rest of it, which are just out of reach for a lot of people these days. So there's all sorts of different things in this broad thought experiment that I think I would like people to think about and ask yourself, like, within that society, if we were to impose 1, 2, all of these things, like, would we be healthier? Would we be happier? Would we need perfectionism just to get by? And so, those are the things that I've suggested in the book. If your listeners are interested, they can go and read the last chapter. And I hope they read it in the spirit that it's intended, which is as a thought experiment rather than a manifesto.
Well, I take it you're referring to the Wall Street Journal review yesterday, which I read. It was, and you're probably hammering yourself. The review was very positive until the final couple sentences where, to me, I think a lot of book reviewers feel they have to say something critical or they're not doing their job. Right. So sometimes I think it's just forced. Like, I got to say, the graphs weren't very well printed, but otherwise it was a great book, something like that. Right. So, I mean, he took a shot at you about the economic policy suggestions, but really your suggestions are not so out of the ordinary if you're, say, maybe a Bernie Sanders supporter or a Andrew Yang supporter. Right. I mean, just the idea of income inequality, UBI, that's part of the national conversation for sure. I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but it's certainly not unusual to suggest something like that. So let's think about that. As I was reading that, I was thinking about Robert Frank's research, The Economist, on that kind of Darwinian competition in the economy, that hedonic treadmill, the kind of relative comparisons. No matter how big your house is, if you have the smallest house on the block, you can have a 10,000 square foot house, and if everybody else has those houses, like in that Varsity Blues the series, which were phenomenal. I've never seen houses quite like that. Just, like 20 bedrooms and all this. Oh my God. You're going to feel unsatisfied. So I guess one of the hard questions, I don't think there is an answer to it, but what's the number? Like a UBI, how many, is it 100,000 a year that you need? Well, it depends on where you live, I guess, what state you're in and so forth. But really, it also depends on what would satisfy you. So I get the, we want to have a floor where everyone has 3 square meals a day, healthcare, and a roof over their head, so they can at least think about tomorrow without having to worry about if they have something to eat or a job, something like that. I get that. But once you're away from the far left wall of destitution and you're in the middle of the bell curve somewhere, Frank's point is that the problem is that your point in your book, people are just not going to be happy because there's always somebody going to be one standard deviation above you, and you aim for them. You're not going to get there because when you get there, they're going to be one more standard deviation up, and it never ends. So how do you solve that problem
But
financially?
I agree with you, and really I'm just so I tell you about John Maynard Keynes. So John Maynard Keynes, for your listeners, was a British economist, and he made a very famous prophecy in the 50, 60 years ago now, where he said that the increases in technological innovation would be such that that we would be spending most of our time doing leisure because the arduous drudgery work is taken care of us by machinery, by technology, and so we can live more of our lives in leisure and less of ourselves working. This is his big prophecy. Now, of course, that hasn't happened. Quite the opposite. But what we have now with the advent of AI and various other technologies, which are really increasing productivity and taking work away from people into the hands of algorithms and all the rest of it, is an opportunity, I think. Is an opportunity to take those productivity gains, the work that we're taking away from people, that we're giving to algorithms, and use that as a kind of productivity dividend that we can use to supplement income and take away the drudgery of everyday work and focus on the things that give us purpose and meaning in those jobs. And I think that's so much more important. If we could do that, if we could use technology in that way, I think that of course, there'll still be status games. Of course, there'll still be hierarchy. Of course, but what you do is you put a floor under destitution. You put a floor under this rat race that's causing a lot of misery, particularly in small towns, deprived communities, people on lower wages, even people who are unemployed. It's kind of, and it's really desperate destitution. I have to say, and I've lived in these communities. I've went to school with these people. I really feel passionate about it because I see it firsthand. And a lot of my friends who have ended up in prison or on the poverty line or in really desperate situations, you keep coming back. There has to be a better way than this kind of very antiquated welfare system. And I think UBI solves the problem of keeping these people down in destitution and giving them a standard of life that's good enough, no more, no less, and allowing them within that context to have leisure time, but also flourish and try to find purpose and meaning. And I know that sounds very waffly. I know it sounds very utopian, but I think we have an opportunity here with the advent of AI and the advent of technology taking away a lot of drudgery of our work. And if we can use it for the common good, we can use it to improve our lives, do what Keynes said many, many years ago, to give us more time in leisure in our communities and less time in our workplace. I mean, that'd be a really positive development, and one that will necessarily mean there's less need for perfectionism. But look, I'm happy to have discussions. I know that, a lot of people disagree, and that's fine. I think it's good to have healthy discussion about these things. I think we should be imaginative, and we should try to work out, how we solve the growth problem, how we solve the inequality problem. And I think it's really good that you're allowing me on to have this debate. I think it's really, really important. So that's where I am with it. And I think with the advent of AI, I think UBI is certainly a feasible and realistic option.
Okay. All right, final subject on parenting and back to the university blues issue in terms of, what your goal is as a parent to raise your children. The whole varsity blues thing, like if my kid doesn't get into Harvard, I'm a crappy parent. Or if my kid doesn't have a great job, then I failed as a parent. As if your job on any given day is to look 20 years down the line and go, okay, what can I do today to get my kid there? As a parent, I just feel this is a huge mistake. That isn't the point. So you have a long discussion of Judith Rich Harris in her book, The Nurture Assumption, which I loved. And she was such a hero
Great book.
of mine that she was able to accomplish all this. Is a very non-traditional career, kicked out of Harvard as having no potential and ends up winning the prize from who's the guy who was her, kicked her out?
I can't remember. Michael, I can't remember. I'd have to look, but it was the same guy who kicked her out, who's the award is named after.
Right. Yeah, I'll think of it in a second. Anyway, but her book, parents don't matter. This is how the media interpret it, which was not her point. It's just not in the way you think that they do. That genetics makes a big difference. Peer groups, mentors, the culture at large, and stuff plays a much larger role. I just had Nancy Siegel on the podcast yesterday. She's the world's leading expert on twins and behavior genetics. And yeah, I mean, the data on this is so robust.
Yep.
The genes and your peer group and culture matter far more than home environment. But matter in what way? I mean, I want my child, like I have a 7-year-old son now, like when I go home today, we're going to play, we're going to do stuff. I want to make his day better now, today. I don't care what happens in 20 years. I'm not even thinking about that. He wants to be loved and feel secure today and tomorrow and the next day. And forget Harvard or whatever. I mean, don't even worry about that stuff. And to me, this is part of the problem you address here. These parents are obsessing about these things. That's the wrong goal.
Yeah, 100%. It's really, so if the parenting, so Judith Harris, just feel fantastic if you can get hold of her work. I strongly encourage you to do so. Remarkable for a woman with a chronic illness, by the way, as well, to be able to make such an imprint on developmental psychology. And her big thing, as you say, was that young people are influenced more by their neighborhoods, peers, culture, society than they are by their parents. But what that doesn't mean is that parents don't matter. This is important. What it means is that parents essentially pass on values, beliefs, attitudes that come from their broader culture. So parents are basically intermediaries. They're, as Heinrich Fromm said, the psychological agents of society, passing down the dominant values to young people. And of course, dominant value right now in Western society is meritocracy, is hard work, is application, is excellence, and keeping letting young people know at all times that they've got to keep going, they've got to keep doing more, they've got to be working hard. Now, I think as parents, it's up to us to, inside that culture, recognize one, that it is important because kids, if they want to have a better life, then their parents are going to need to do well in school, because that's still the only guaranteed ticket if they can get themselves into elite university and into one of those very narrow set of professions that pay the most money. And so it's a very real pressure. But within that pressure, you can still provide what we call unconditional regard, warm parenting. You can know that the children are going to slip up, they're going to fail, and you can teach them that those failures are very humanizing and not humiliating experiences. And at all times, give them unconditional love and support. All times, just keep loving them, love them, love them, love them all the time. So when they've done well, praise them, praise the effort, put their hand over their shoulder and say, I'm proud of you. But when they haven't done quite so well, tell them the same. And show them that it's okay, that this is just one grade among many different other grades that you're going to be given across your time at school, right? It's not an indictment on you. It doesn't say anything about your talents or abilities. It doesn't say anything about whether your teacher likes you. It doesn't say anything about whether your parents love you. It's just a number among many other numbers. And we can go down the growth mindset route. You can tell them it's a learning opportunity, a development opportunity. If you want to, that's fine. But more important is that your affection, your approval, your love is not contingent on those outcomes. That's so, I can't emphasize how crucial that is. So unconditional love and support, warm parenting, and teach them that failure is humanizing, not humiliating. And at all times also, this is also important, if you do have perfectionistic tendencies, young people look, they learn, they will see those things. And so it's important to, just as you apply those rules to your kids, make sure you try and apply them to yourself.
What's growth mindset again?
Growth mindset is where it's kind of this fixed versus growth mindset that Carol Dweck talks about, where essentially fixed mindset, where it is things like intelligence and aptitude and ability and talents are fixed, right? It can't be improved. So you're either gifted or you're not. And then the growth mindset is a mindset where all these things can be developed, they can be improved. And so if you work hard, you put the effort in, and you can learn from your setbacks and mistakes, and you can grow, right? You can develop those things, you can get better, you can get higher grades, get better in your sports, get better in your work, whatever it is that you do. So that's the difference between the two. And of course, the growth mindset is healthier or purportedly healthier, although some of the data coming through recently is not necessarily showing great effects of the growth mindset interventions, but nevertheless, it's purportedly healthy in terms of achievement outcomes and happiness than a fixed mindset.
Yeah, also, one of my gripes is people focusing on happiness. I don't think that's the right metric. I think it's purposefulness or meaningfulness, doing things, being happy. Maybe it's the wrong word, subjective well-being, I think is the other term that I think maybe captures what we're after there. I mean, the goal in life shouldn't just be walking around with a beatific smile on your face. That's no fun. That's boring. Right? You got to have some drama and stress to make it interesting. The other thing about money, money and happiness. Oh, after a certain level, you're not going to be any happier. Well, that turns out not to be true. But in any case, that's the wrong goal. It's not money for that reason. It's opportunity and freedom and autonomy that money buys you. And if so, you got to set the right goal for what you're aiming for. Which, like in my case, is like I just want to have enough money so I don't have to think about money.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I don't really care. And I think people get misfocused on that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think life is about meaning. It is about purpose, and finding something that you're passionate about is also important. Um, I would, and also it goes the other gripe I have is with this idea of a mindset, because I don't really want my mind to be set on anything.
Oh, that's right.
Do you know what I mean? So like this
Yeah.
is the other thing I have with these kind of movements. It's really, your mind's got to be set on growth. Well, fine, but like taken to an extreme, that's perfectionism. You constantly pushing, constantly working, constantly trying to improve yourself. That's perfection, right? So it goes back to this again, what we were saying earlier. There's a middle, there's a happy medium here. Moderation is really important for us to recognize that, our mind doesn't have to be set on growth. Sometimes we can be sad, that's okay. Sometimes we can feel frustrated, that's okay. Sometimes we can feel like a bit of a victim, and that's also okay. And sometimes we can feel like really happy, elated, over the moon, joyous, and all the rest of it, and that's wonderful. And these are just kind of part and parcel of being a human. So I'm with you there 100% of the way.
All right, last question on the debate over what's the cause of the spike in teen depression, anxiety, cutting more in girls than boys? Is it social media, screen time? Is it Facebook? Is it is it helicopter parenting? I just had Gene Twangy on the podcast about generational differences in parenting in terms of, focusing more attention on fewer offspring, that life history theory and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
I love the work of Jean. I think she's done some remarkable research, particularly in generational trends. She's certainly been the springboard for my own work on generational differences in perfectionism, and I owe a great deal of gratitude for her thinking and her methodologies that have allowed me to do those research studies. One thing I would say is that I think the analysis of those trends could take somewhat more of a more macro lens. I think there's a tendency to individualize these things a little bit. Not to say that individual factors aren't important, of course, but I think there are more broader social, cultural factors at play that are driving these changes. And certainly for me, it's the expansion of social media. It's the relentless pressure in schools and colleges, which have got a lot more difficult to get into, particularly the top ones, as we discussed. Insecure workplaces that make it very difficult to get on. The concept of a career these days among young people is kind of a foreign concept, really. They kind of hustle and grind their way through different gigs, which is exhausting. And of course, parenting. We talked about parenting too, responding to these environmental pressures. But all of them, every single one of them, they're not. There's a tendency to treat them as kind of interesting happenstances, right? Oh, that's an interesting phenomenon, and this is an interesting phenomenon, and they're kind of treated very separately as things we point out and look and frown kind of disapprovingly at and think, oh, really, that's curious, without really interrogating what the common root of all of those things are. And for me, the common root of all of those things is living inside an economy that needs to grow way, way more than we need to feel content. And if we live inside an economy that has to grow at all costs, then what that means is, of course, we're going to have to be held in a state of discontent, of insecurity, of uncertainty. That means advertising thrives because it keeps us in those states. It means social media takes advantage of those tendencies to sell us products that keep us consuming, that keep us creating jobs and growing the economy, that keeps us in a state of constant overwork and pressure to continually justify ourselves based on our merit, which manifests itself in schools, colleges, and the way those ranking and incentive structures work, as we talked about earlier, but also in the workplace. In order for companies and businesses to continually grow, they need to slimline, they need to slim down, they need to make sure that they have as few responsibilities and obligations to their employees as possible. So they contract with them now rather than employing them, which is good for the company, of course. It's arguable whether that's quite as good for the employee. We can have that debate. And so all of these different changes that I've talked about in parenting and all the rest of it come from an economy that has to continually grow at all costs. And I think that's what I try to do in the Perfection Trap, is to really drill into the root cause of these phenomena, and in the end, try to offer some ways out. Because if it is a cultural phenomenon, if it is a societal problem, then yes, we can focus on individual things that we can do in ourselves, but we also have to focus on what we can collectively do together to create a culture and a society that requires less perfectionism. And so really that's the big conclusion.
Yeah, sort of like the sports analogy again. You can hardly blame Zuckerberg for wanting Facebook to make a lot of money by selling ads, by inventing things like the like button to keep people on there longer so they can sell more ads. That's their job.
Exactly.
That's what he's paid to do.
But by the way, there's no blame. Like, I try in the book to be as compassionate as possible. There's no blame for anyone involved in these industries or working in these. Absolutely not. This is the way the economy works. And I've worked for firms. I've worked for all sorts of things. I'm sure people may call me a hypocrite or whatever. It's not the case. Like we work in this way because we have to. There's no alternative. It's like going back to the Lance Armstrong example. Like, we live in the society that we live in, not the one we want to live in, right? And all of us have a role to play within that society. I'm just trying to shine the light, really, on what it is about that particular system that creates these tendencies. And I'm not saying, viva la revolution or whatever. But what I am saying is, I hope through that understanding that people get a much deeper and crystal clear perspective of where those inattentions are coming from, where those feelings of deficit and lack are coming from. And I hope just that takes a lot of personal power away from those feelings, and provides some solace. Yeah,
I feel sorry for these youngsters going on these sites where the visuals they see are the Six Sigma, most beautiful women, most handsome men. And by definition, you're probably going to be in the middle of the bell curve. You are in the mean. You're not going to look like that person, no matter what you do. And they may not even actually look like that because they have all those filters and things that they use.
Well, that's it. Yeah, that's the other part of it.
My wife and I used to watch just our junk TV for fun, The Bachelor and Bachelorette, where every one of these guys, there's like 20 of them on the show that want to win the heart of the Bachelorette. They're all like 6'1", ripped, six-pack stomachs and just gorgeous hair. And I'm just, I'm 5'7", and look at that. Oh, man. So depressing. Look at these guys. And, of course, the opposite, every one of the women when it's The Bachelor, they're all just perfect models. Like, how can anybody watch this and compare themselves?
But, Michael, I bet you can go uphill faster.
Maybe. Yeah. These guys that bodybuild and they lift weights and stuff, they don't have much cardio, I bet.
There you go.
That's right. All right, Thomas, that was fun. Great conversation. What's next on your research agenda? What are you working on right now?
Wonderful to speak to you. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been great to chat. I'm still working on perfectionism. I'm trying to set up an open source repository so that we can keep tabs on perfectionism into the present day levels. And I'm also really interested in belonging at the moment, a sense of the social connection. I think the loneliness epidemic worries me. Something I've taken an interest in more recently is to try to unpack that. And one of the things that might be behind it is declining levels of belonging, sense of belonging with other people and community. So that's probably the next big thing that I'm looking at, but I'm still continue to work in the area of perfection.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's what social media was supposed to solve, right? We can all be connected online, and Father McKinsey and what's her name? Oh, Eleanor Rigby and Father McKinsey could be Facebook friends or something. That just actually hasn't really happened.
No, quite the opposite. So that interests me. So I think that's probably where I'll go next.
That's good. That's important. All right. Good place to stop. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mark.